My name is Nir Arieli. I'm a lecturer in international history at the University of Leeds, and I am going to be talking about a question from the A-level curriculum. The question is, how far do you agree that American support for a Jewish homeland in the years 1945 to 1948 was the main reason for the emergence of an independent state of Israel? To answer this question, we must first of all address a broader question. Why did Britain, the country that controlled Palestine since the First World War, decide to leave Palestine? And this will help us to place America's involvement in a broader perspective, in a proper perspective. At the end of the Second World War, Britain was broke. It was heavily indebted, primarily but not only to the United States, and economic considerations were at the forefront of most ministers' minds through the whole period from 1945 till 1948. One of the ways in which the British government sought to save some money was by cutting the number of men and women who were under arms at the end of the war. Demobilization was popular, and it made sense for a Labour government. It was elected in 1945, and Labour government was intent on reviving and reforming the British economy. Furthermore, there was a lack of sufficient manpower, especially in export industries, so demobilizing people made sense. Therefore, in 1946, the government sought to reduce the three services to 1.2 million men and women. Bearing that in mind, maintaining peace in Palestine was very hard work. The late 1930s saw a long and very bloody Arab revolt, which British forces struggled to suppress. As the Second World War was ending, a Jewish revolt in Palestine was about to begin. So on the face of it, the case for decolonization in general, and in the case of Palestine in particular, was quite strong. On the other hand, the empire meant maintaining Britain's international influence. This is something that the new foreign minister, Ernest Bevin, did not want to relinquish. Not quite thinking in terms of the inevitability of decolonization, he hoped to gain time for Britain to recover its pre-war strength. Bevin and the chiefs of staff sought to retain Britain's position in the Middle East. They hoped to ward off Russian advances, and we must remember that this was when the Cold War was beginning to emerge. And they also sought to maintain friendly relations with the Arab countries, recognizing their importance in guaranteeing the flow of oil to Britain. No less than 60% of Britain's oil came from the region. In the middle of 1946, the position of the chiefs of staff was, and I quote, "All our defense requirements in the Middle East, including maintenance of our essential oil supplies and communications, demand that an essential feature of our policy should be to retain the cooperation of the Arab states and to ensure that the Arab world does not gravitate towards the Russians." This brings us to the Jewish revolt. British policy towards Palestine in the period we are concerned with had been set in the White Paper of 1939. The White Paper of 1939 backtracked on Britain's earlier support for Zionism, and it restricted the number of Jewish immigrants who are allowed into Palestine. British Zionist tensions that emerged after the White Paper were set aside during the Second World War, but come the end of the war, they resurfaced. And when the horrors of the Holocaust became known, the Zionist struggle to attain an independent Jewish state reached unprecedented proportions. In October 1945, the three Jewish paramilitary organizations in Palestine, the Haganah, the biggest organization, the Irgun, and the Fighter for the Freedom of Israel, better known as the Stern Gang, temporarily joined forces and formed the movement of the Hebrew Revolt. They began to carry out attacks against British targets in Palestine. For instance, they attacked a camp near the coast where illegal Jewish immigrants were held, and they freed 208 of them. They sabotaged railways and attacked British coastal positions, again, in order to allow more illegal Jewish refugees to reach the country. And in June 1946, they blew up 11 bridges that connected Palestine with neighboring countries, all in one night. The Jewish population in Palestine was fairly small. We're talking about roughly 600,000 people. To contend with them, the British had to keep approximately 100,000 troops and police in the country. And all this at a time when Britain was trying to reduce the size of its military. In late June 1946, British troops in Palestine launched Operation Agatha, which was an attempt to topple the revolt by arresting a large section of the Zionist leadership. The Irgun, one of the paramilitary organizations, retaliated by planting a bomb at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, where the British Army headquarters and several government officials were based. As you can see from the image, the explosion was quite immense, and it killed over 90 people and completely destroyed one of the wings of the hotel. The Jewish revolt continued well into 1947, and it severely undermined the morale of British troops in Palestine as well as that of their superiors in London. In October 1945, the American President Harry S. Truman publicly declared his support for the Zionist call to allow 100,000 Jewish refugees from Europe into Palestine. He reiterated his support for the 100,000 proposal several times in the following months. Truman was to an extent motivated by electoral considerations. In other words, he was hoping to gain the Jewish vote. Many of the experts in the Pentagon and the State Department actually thought immigration should be restricted, but eventually the president had the final word. In Britain, Bevin was angered by Truman's position. He believed that such a move would alienate Muslim public opinion not only in the Middle East but also in British India. Furthermore, the Jews might see this as, and I'm using his words, the thin end of the wedge. They would raise their demands once the demand to allow 100,000 people into the country would be granted. Bevin tried to resolve the Palestine problem in various ways before reaching a complete impasse. First of all, he tried to get the Americans more involved. An Anglo-American committee was announced in late 1945, reaching Palestine in spring 1946. Bevin declared at the outset that he hoped that the committee will decide to relieve Britain of its obligations towards Palestine and establish an international trusteeship instead. The committee's report, published in May 1946, tried to reconcile the British and American positions. On the one hand, it asked to allow 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine, but on the other, it hoped to place the country, to place Palestine under international trusteeship. The report was rejected by the Arabs and the Jews. There were widespread demonstrations in Arab cities, in Palestine and the rest of the Middle East, and on the Jewish side, the attacks against British targets was renewed with vigor. British and American officials continued to discuss the situation in Palestine, and these discussions eventually resulted in the Morrison-Grady Plan. The Morrison-Grady Plan envisaged maintaining some form of British presence in Palestine while dividing the country into 4 semi-autonomous cantons. However, in October 1946, Truman rejected this proposal. Instead, he began to support the idea of partitioning Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs, partitioning Palestine, that is, into two independent states. And again, he renewed his call to allow a significant number of Jewish immigrants into the country as soon as possible. The British then tried to organize an Arab-Jewish conference to try to work out a settlement which would be acceptable to both sides. This effort too did not meet any success, simply because a compromise could not be found. By now, Bevin was ready to give up, and in a joint memorandum by the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and the Secretary of State for the Colonies, he declared there is no hope of negotiating an agreed settlement. Moreover, the views expressed on behalf of the State Department in recent telegrams leave us with the impression that the United States government will to the end remain an uncertain and unreliable factor in this problem. On the 18th of February 1947, Bevin announced at the House of Commons that the Palestine problem would be referred to the United Nations. Bevin later explained that the decision to transfer the Palestine problem to the United Nations came about because neither the Jews nor the Arabs agreed to the proposals put forward by the British government. The UN began its deliberations over Palestine in spring 1947. It sent the United Nations Special Committee for Palestine to investigate. The UN committee reported back in September and put forward two proposals. The majority of the committee's members proposed to partition Palestine between two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, while the minority report wanted to turn Palestine into one independent federal state. As the deliberations at the United Nations continued, the British government secretly decided to withdraw from Palestine as soon as international circumstances allowed, and to do so without assisting or trying to impose partition on the population. The General Assembly of the UN decided to adopt the majority proposal, and the proposal to partition Palestine between two states was voted on at the end of November 1947. The Zionists lobbied for the proposal to be accepted, while the Arabs rejected it entirely. To be accepted, the proposal required a two-thirds majority. Eventually, 33 countries voted in favor, 13 objected, and 10 countries abstained. So the resolution was accepted. Interestingly, both the United States and the Soviet Union voted for partition, a very rare instance of superpower agreement at a time when the Cold War was gaining momentum. Britain abstained. Now, let us briefly examine the position of the United States during the first few months of the first Arab-Israeli war that erupted soon afterwards. Violence between Arabs and Jews in Palestine started almost immediately after the UN resolution was accepted. In the first few months leading up to the final withdrawal of British troops from Palestine, the Arabs seemed to have the upper hand. In this context, President Truman's support for partition was beginning to waver. Officials and diplomats at the State Department, who were never very enthusiastic about partition, began to lobby for the plan to be set aside, and they even revived the idea of an international trusteeship. However, in the spring of 1948, the President reiterated his public support for partition, and he did so for a number of reasons. One, the Zionists placed considerable diplomatic pressure on the White House. Two, Truman wanted to secure the Jewish vote in the upcoming presidential elections in November 1948. And three, in March and April 1948, Zionist forces managed to defeat the Palestinian Arabs, showing the Americans that the nascent Jewish state would be capable of defending itself. Once the British withdrawal was complete in mid-May 1948, the Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion announced the establishment of an independent State of Israel. Truman recognized the newly established state only minutes after it was proclaimed, without consulting the State Department. The next day, the neighboring Arab countries invaded Israel and turned the conflict between Palestinian Arabs and Jews into a war between states. Bearing in mind the question, we mustn't overestimate the importance of US government support for Zionism. Militarily, the Zionists certainly were not able to rely on Truman. Indeed, the US government imposed an arms embargo on the region as early as December 1947. The United States also adhered to the UN arms embargo of May 1948. In the decades and the wars that followed, Israel relied heavily on US support, especially in the supply of weapons, but this was not the case in 1948. The very substantial help that Israel was able to receive from America was raised unofficially among Jewish communities in the United States. The millions of dollars that were raised in a number of fundraising campaigns were used to purchase weapons for Israel privately, often outside the US in countries like Czechoslovakia. There were also several hundred volunteers, mainly Jews but not only, who came to Israel from the United States, Britain, France, Canada, South Africa, and other countries. These international volunteers, especially the Americans who went to fight in Israel, did so against the express wishes of their governments. So to conclude, after the Second World War, the British government found itself in a difficult predicament when dealing with Palestine. It sought not to antagonize the US, which in Palestine would translate into a pro-Zionist policy, but also at the same time maintaining friendly relations with the Arab states, which in Palestine meant supporting the Palestinian Arabs. Attlee, the British Prime Minister, and to a lesser extent Bevin, came around to the idea of cutting Britain's losses in Palestine in late 1946. They had reached this decision even though the Chiefs of Staff wanted Britain to stay on. A combination of factors led to the British decision to abandon Palestine. First, we must remember the post-war fatigue and the pressing economic considerations. Second, the Jewish revolt, which was proving very hard to quell. Furthermore, there was the international support the Zionists were able to muster for the plight of Jewish refugees in Europe. Indeed, the British policy of imposing a naval blockade on Palestine to prevent ships with refugees reaching the country made for very bad press. Then there was Truman's obstruction of British compromise proposals, and finally the impasse the British had reached in trying to find a settlement that would be acceptable by the Arabs on the one hand and the Jews on the other. American support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine was important. Certainly on the diplomatic front, the Zionists benefited from President Truman's fairly continuous support. And this helped to block British initiatives which were detrimental to the Zionist cause. Truman's support for the Partition plan at the UN in November 1947, and even more importantly, his swift recognition of Israel in May 1948, helped the Zionists immeasurably. However, the British government did not decide to abandon Palestine on the basis of American pressure alone. On the contrary, London was not always sure where exactly Washington was heading. Furthermore, the Zionists did not receive any official military support from the United States in their war against the Arabs. At the end of the day, it was victory in the 1948 war which guaranteed Israel's independence. So, to answer the question, how far do you agree that American support for a Jewish homeland in the years 1945 to 1948 was the main reason for the emergence of an independent state of Israel? As we have seen, American support was important, but certainly not the only reason.